You've got 10 seconds. The countdown going on right now. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it the wrong way.
This is Play-by-Playcast, the world's #1 sports media podcast. Wait, what?
Nobody's fact-checking it. Just keep going.
Here we go.
Who the hell is Happy Gilmore?
Got all that on camera, right, John?
Sure, I did.
All right, because the red light was not on.
The podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster.
Oh, you can stick me in some kind of Italian boat because that one is gondola.
Now, from New York, really?
All the big ones are from New York.
Your host, Joe Godet.
It's still Joel.
Yeah, he will not be able to see very well, Cotton.
All right, episode number 157 of Play-by-Playcast. Thanks as always for the subscribe, the stream, the download. You have found the podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster. Professional development podcast that dives into the tips, tricks, experience, stories, process, and preparation of some of the biggest and best play-by-play announcers in the business. My name, of course, is Joel Godet. You can find us on social media at PXPcast. I am at Joel Godet, JoelGodett, and I am back from España. I'm one of those people that needs a vacation from my vacation, though. Like, I was thinking about it yesterday. I can't even remember what I did on the first day I was there. Because, like, day 2, 3, and 4, I jam-packed so much stuff into 1 week. Like, I was tourist McTourist. If you could do it, I did it. I didn't even eat lunch. I did not eat lunch one day I was there. Too much to do. And, like, by the time I got around to eating lunch, it'd be 4 o'clock, and I was like, you know what? I'll wait for dinner. Which I found out didn't start until, like, 8:30 in Spain. So I just waited a little longer. But it was a good vacation. Still just a little pooped. But next week, get to go home and then get right into the thick of things. Chance to call the Little League World Series softball action on ESPN 3+. I think it's on Plus the next week after that. And then the week after that, or I think a couple days after that, heading to Costa Rica with Ball State men's basketball for the international tour that NCAA teams are allowed the opportunity to take every 4 years. And then it's fall football training camp. So here we go. Summer is all but over if you're a college announcer or if specifically you're me. Media days are just around the corner, so we're all getting right back into the thick of things. Our guest today comes from the Big 12. His name is John Walters. He is the voice of the Iowa State Cyclones, and a whole bunch of different things to touch on. We'll talk about his getting into play-by-play because he always wanted to be a play-by-play announcer, but he started or at least immediately before he was the voice of the Cyclones. He was the voice at Drake, but he was also a television sports director. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We will get into a unique aspect of his job in that, and I didn't know this, Iowa State has its own network. Like BYU, the university has its own network, and of course there's the Longhorn Network. Iowa State has what's called Cyclones.tv. It is a 24-hour network. It streams, but it's also linear in many parts of the state of Iowa. And John is in charge of that, which I thought was a cool little twist to his job that many of us don't have on our plates. So what's it like to deal with programming a network, so to speak, and how that network will change as the landscape of sports media changes and ESPN deals and all that are coming up here. So we'll get into it with John Walters. We start at the very beginning, though, with his initial love for play-by-play on this week's episode of PXPcast.
Well, what really got started for me in play-by-play was when I was growing up, and I was the youngest kid in my class. My birthday was Halloween, and so most of my friends in my class were a year older than I was. And combine that with not great athleticism, but loved playing. I mean, every day after school, it was baseball, football, basketball, didn't matter. We were playing every single day. And I just loved sports and I loved being around it. I loved, watching games, listening to games. I grew up in Chicago in the suburbs in Glen Ellen, Illinois. And we had great announcers in Chicago, and Jim Durham doing the Bulls games, Lloyd Pettit doing the Blackhawks. Harry Carey eventually doing the White Sox and then the Cubs. And So I had the opportunity to listen to some really great play-by-play when I was a young kid and just enjoyed it. I always thought it was fun. I enjoyed the announcers as much as I enjoyed the games. And you eventually came to the realization that I'm not going to be doing anything playing sports, but I want to be around it on a daily basis. And I lucked into the fact that we had a high school radio station, WGHS, 10-watt station, Glenbard West High School. And you couldn't hear it with, 2 tin cans and a piece of string between. It would have been about the same reception, but it didn't matter because you're still calling the games, and it doesn't matter if anybody's listening or not. You're getting that experience of doing it. And so I did our high school football and basketball games, and that's when I really knew that's what I wanted to do. And started paying even closer attention to Jim Durham, especially the Bulls announcer at the time, picking up on little things that he would say and ways he would describe things, and maybe kind of stealing a thing or two from him, but just kind of tailoring my style to that, and just did as much play-by-play as I possibly could. And then I went to college for it at Drake University in Des Moines, and wanted to go to a smaller university because I wanted to really get hands-on right away and get as many opportunities as I could. And I pretty much did play-by-play throughout my years at Drake, and then got into local television as a full-time job, but always had my eye on play-by-play. And even just a couple of years into my full-time profession in TV, asked our sports director if I could do Drake women's basketball games because an opening was there to do about a dozen games. Did those. Really enjoyed them for about 4 years. Then the men's basketball job opened, and I switched over to the men's side and did 7 years of Drake men's basketball, and then eventually ended up and was balancing TV with it. And that was difficult at times, especially when I started doing the men's games because I was doing every game. And I was making up every day that I was gone at the TV station where I worked. Yeah, so I worked pretty much straight through from the time basketball season started till it ended. There weren't very many days off, maybe 1 or 2, but it was that important to me to do it. I really wanted to do it and get as much experience doing play-by-play. I knew that's what I really ultimately wanted to do. And ultimately, it ended up leading to television work with ESPN Plus and the Missouri Valley Conference. I did some Missouri Valley games for their network, and then I did ESPN Plus with the Big 12 and with Iowa State. And ultimately ended up leading to when Pete Taylor, the man who introduced me to the business, really, who hired me at my first TV job, passed away very tragically. I took his spot on the radio and continue my work in TV as a sports director. But play-by-play has always been my passion. It's always been what I've enjoyed, and that's kind of the path I took. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, we got all the time in the world. It's a podcast.
That's true.
A couple things I want to dissect there, and the first one is being a television anchor or a television sports director and also being the voice of a team, and how that was viewed. And I guess it's different, particularly on the women's side, and it was probably great because now it's this inroad to like getting yourself on television more a little bit because the TV guy knows your story. But when you go over to the men's side, how did you toe the line of, hey, he's our guy, he's our voice, versus being also the down the middle sports anchor, trusted newsman, so to speak, in that role?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I treated it really like two separate worlds almost. When I was in my sports anchor position, I probably bent over backwards to make sure that I was very fair to the other teams in our market. Maybe even went too far in the direction of trying to, come off as being fair and not biased towards the school that I was doing play-by-play for. I think I was fortunate in that the person who hired me, as I mentioned, Pete Taylor, was the voice of the Cyclones for 33 years, and Pete had balanced those two jobs beautifully. Had done a great job, sports director at the number 1 ranked station in Iowa, KCCI, and also the play-by-play voice of Iowa State. And nobody ever questioned Pete's integrity at all. In fact, he had probably more integrity than just about anybody you would come across. And so I think he balanced it really well, and that probably laid a foundation for me to be able to do the same thing. I was very fortunate in that regard. And then you have to have bosses on the TV side that understand your passion of what you want to do ultimately in your profession, and a willingness to go along with that, because that part's very difficult. And as people try to get into play-by-play, finding that other, not many people can just do play-by-play and have that be their living when they're starting out, unless you are lucky enough to, all of a sudden become the voice of the Chicago Bulls or something. And so, you have to kind of ease your way into it, and you have to have another full-time job, but one with the willingness to give you that flexibility to be available. And I think that the people I worked for at the time at KCCI TV in Des Moines were very fair to me. Again, I made sure that I was fair to them too. I said, look, I want to come in and make up the days that I'm going to be gone when I'm traveling with the team. I don't want it to be a strain on you and your staff. And so, they were willing to go along with that. And I don't think if I had probably not done that, I probably wouldn't have gotten that opportunity. But again, it was so important to me to get as much play-by-play experience as possible.
Well, and I guess also that comes hand in hand with having a TV station that understands, or being able to make the case, like, why this is good for the TV station, that you have somebody who is also the voice of the Bulldogs, or in Pete's case, who is the voice of the Cyclones, and why that can be a symbiotic relationship, and trying to find the reason of what benefits the TV station and letting you do that.
Well, I think so. And I think it does help in some regards. When you're trying to break stories on TV and you're well connected at a university, it does help you break a few stories. You find out a few things. And so, but even at the schools that I wasn't the play-by-play voice for, I was fortunate to be able to break some stories about what was going on with their universities as well. And so, I tried to treat it separately, but there's no question. There's some overlap there. And I think from an audience perspective, if they're a fan of that team, sure, that has to help. They're probably going to watch your station when it comes time to watch the sportscast. But hopefully you're fair enough to the other teams that they'll still watch under those circumstances.
How did you and Pete Taylor first interact? How did you first develop a relationship?
So I was a student at Drake and doing as much play-by-play as I could, and doing just a little bit of TV stuff. I had, just gotten into TV a little bit, was really learning about that. Didn't really have any intention of getting into TV. And our Drake professor, John Lytle, came to three of us and said, hey, there's an opening for a part-time news reporter at KCCI TV in Des Moines, #1 station. You'd work about 20 hours a week. You'd work weekends. But they want to, and back then you did that kind of stuff. Now you would never see a college student put into that role, but it was a little different back then. It was a little different. And so myself and two far more qualified people went to the news director. Paul Rhodes was his name, no relation to our former football coach.
I was going to say.
And sat in front of him, and he looked at my stuff and he says, well, John, it looks like everything you've done is in sports. And I said, yeah, that's pretty much true. And he said, why don't you go across the hall and talk to Pete Taylor, our sports director? And so I did. And I walked in and said, hey, Pete, I introduced myself. And he said, great. Can you go to the Iowa-Wisconsin game this Saturday? I'm like, yeah, that'd be great, And so I just very, very lucky. And they obviously hired one of the other people that was interviewing for the news position. I was thanking my lucky stars for the way that meeting with Paul Rhodes went, because I never really was that interested in being a news anchor or a reporter anyway. I'd much rather be in sports. And so when he sent me across the hall, I was in heaven, and Pete couldn't have been better about it. And I didn't even know if I had a job yet. I went to that Iowa-Wisconsin game, and, then he kept sending me the other stuff. And next thing you know, I was getting a paycheck and worked there part-time all the way through the rest of my college years. And then ended up transitioning into a full-time role when I graduated. But he was absolutely a gem. I mean, one of the best people you could ever possibly meet, tremendous broadcaster. We lost him way too young, at age 57. And you would have never thought he would ever have a health problem. He was the healthiest guy he'd ever been around. And it was just a tragic loss when we lost him. But I was very fortunate to be one of Pete's best friends. Certainly he was one of my best friends without any doubt. I think a lot of people call him their best friend. But we had a great relationship, and he was always really, really good to me through all those years.
What made him great?
The lack of an ego, I think, is what made Pete great. He never took himself too seriously. He took the broadcast seriously, and he prepared and did a great job. Nobody was more on top of the action and able to describe things well than Pete. But at the same time, he brought a connection, and you're familiar with this. When a broadcaster really makes that connection with their fan base and they feel like that's one of them, and they feel like they know Pete. Everybody felt like they knew Pete inside and out, and that's I think in that era of play-by-play, and we're talking in the 70s and 80s when not as many games were on TV. Those play-by-play broadcasters for a local team were gold, and that's how you saw the games, and Pete described them so beautifully, and fans just felt that connection. And but he never got carried away with that. He never started thinking he was something sensational because of that. He just was very humble and down to earth, but fun, and had a great sense of humor, and just a joy to be around. And so I think all those things combined made Pete what he was.
How hard do you think that is nowadays? Because I feel like there's a sense in this industry, and maybe ego is not the right word, but you've got to have a healthy confidence in yourself and your ability. Otherwise, you can very easily get eaten up by it. But at the same time, it's so important to not let that overwhelm you for all of the reasons you just mentioned. Why and how was he able to strike the right balance, and how do we all go about doing that?
Boy, that's a tremendous question, and yeah, you're right. Everybody has an ego. Can you check it at the door? Matt Campbell, our football coach, says ego is the enemy. He takes it on even more strongly. But I think realizing that a lot of people are good at their jobs, and you happen to have a job where you're describing games and you're calling them for an audience, and with that comes a lot of attentions at times, and people generally like you when they see you. If they're a fan of that team, they want to say hi, they want to share a story about their favorite game, and I think you need to embrace that. I loved what Bob Costas said once about interacting with fans out in public, and how it takes just as long to be a jerk to somebody as it does to be genuine and say something nice to them and make their day. And you never know, especially if you're talking to a kid, the impact that could have. That might be something that 15 years later, a kid that's interested in broadcasting says, well, I remember being warmly embraced by the voice of the Hawkeyes or the voice of the Bulldogs or whatever the case may be. And he was genuine and nice to me, and it really encouraged me to keep going. And I think for me, that blessing was Pete, having somebody who treated me with a lot of respect, probably more than I deserved early on, really gave me the confidence to keep going with it. And so I think it's important to understand that, your actions do affect people. And sometimes you might think it's just a quick little interaction that's you're going to forget about in maybe 2 days, but that person that you're talking to might not forget about it for quite some time if it was a big deal to them to talk to you. And so I think that's important, but at the same time, not getting so carried away with it that you think that it should be a big deal to that person to talk to you. You want to treat them like a human being and share their passion for their team. And so I just think being grounded is really important. And that was another great lesson, I hope, for me from Pete, because that's exactly the way he was.
How about on the air? What did you most take away from what he did on the air? And I guess what were those things? What did he best do? What made him outstanding to listen to?
Well, I just think the ease of his voice. He never he had a great voice for radio. But also a friendliness to that voice, which when I talked about that connection with the fans earlier, I think that was the thing that Pete did so beautifully, was have a welcoming voice that people felt unintimidated by, and they wanted to welcome that voice into their living room every week. And I probably picked up a lot from Pete and a lot from the broadcasters I listened to in Chicago. I mentioned Jim Durham. I guess style-wise, probably more of my style came from him, although I certainly picked up a lot from Pete and just the way he handled things and ultimately the way he treated people. That was the number one thing, because he treated everybody that he interacted with in a great way and made them all feel terrific. And I never met anybody who walked away from a conversation with him without a smile on their face, whether he just told a joke or just made them feel good, and that's kind of the gift that he had that I think we all wish we had.
If I can turn it inwards toward you now, above and beyond that, what do you think most grasps somebody into a broadcast? What differentiates something from being a good call to a great call?
I think description is the key. I feel like radio play-by-play has changed so much through the years just because so many games are on TV, and now there's more people turning down the TV and listening to the radio. So they're probably seeing the game in a lot of cases, and it used to be the opposite. But I don't think the art of sportscasting, to borrow the title of Tom Hedrick's book, which I religiously offer up to students who are interested in this, because I think it's such a great how-to book. But I don't think the art of sportscasting itself has really changed that much. I think you're still trying to provide as detailed a call as you can of the action, maybe without going overboard on that detail. I've heard announcers that, it can maybe be a little bit too much detail, chest high dribble. Now it's a knee high dribble. Now chest high again. Now knee high again. It's just dribbling out in your half court. So it doesn't have to be maybe described with that detail. But as you get deeper into the play, and it's the important aspects of it, for people to be able to draw that visual image of what you saw and be able to recreate that in their minds, I think is the real key. There's nothing worse than listening to a broadcast on the radio where it's just Johnson has the ball, now it's over to Stevens, now Williams has it, back to Johnson, and you never know where the ball was on the floor. You never have any idea how well defended a player was. You don't know if they were in a scoring position or if they were just holding the ball. Those little details really add up and provide, I think, a better call. And so to me, that's the beauty of radio play-by-play. I've done both. I've done television play-by-play, which is much more of just a conversation. And I think in television play-by-play, the analyst is the superstar, and you want to set up that analyst and allow their wisdom about the game to come through, and you're just more the traffic cop that's along for the ride. I don't think you want to take over a broadcast as a TV play-by-play, and I probably learned that the hard way. I probably was that guy that was talking way too much when I started doing TV, but I think as the years went on, I got better at it. But radio, it's really important for that play-by-play guy to be as descriptive as he can, but also have great energy, and I think if somebody's listening to a game and they're sensing that play-by-play broadcaster would rather be somewhere else, why in the heck would they invest the time in wanting to listen to that game? If they can tell that, even if it's a blowout, that, and I'm not saying your emotions don't come into play and you don't have a different tone to your voice when it's 55 to nothing. You do. There's no question. But I think you still have to try to make it fun and interesting and entertaining. And they're not going to stay connected if you're not going to stay connected. So I think that's really important.
Where do you go in a situation like that? We always say that, hey, if you're down 55-0, it's a great opportunity to tell stories. And it is, but how do you approach it, and how do you keep it relevant to what is in front of you while still being interesting?
I think one of the things that maybe just comes naturally because you get connected to the program that you're covering is that you share the fans' frustration in those moments. And I don't think anything summed it up. Unfortunately, at Iowa State, through the years, we have had some examples of very lopsided losses that have gone against us in football. And I'll give you a story of one that was maybe an all-time classic for us and I've been really blessed. I worked with Gary Thompson on TV, who was legendary, did games with, Dick Enberg, and just a terrific color man. And then when I went over to radio, I worked with Eric Heft, and I've continued to work with Eric for my whole, going into my 17th year. And Eric was a great player at Iowa State and a terrific broadcaster entering his 41st year on basketball and 36th on football. So he's been my broadcast partner the whole time. But we, through the years, have developed a pretty good relationship and some chemistry. And, Iowa State was when Art Briles really had it rolling at Baylor. They were steamrolling Iowa State in Waco. It was really ugly. And it was, I believe, 63-0. And that would have been the most lopsided shutout loss in Iowa State history. And so Iowa State scored the by the way touchdown with about a minute 30 to go. And I made the comment, well, at least it won't be the worst loss in school history now. And Eric said, there's always the kickoff. There's always the kickoff, And so sure enough, Iowa State kicks off. Corey Coleman, who went on to play in the NFL, fields the kick at about the 2-yard line. Off he goes. And about halfway down the field, my voice was just like, oh, geez, here we go. And by the end of the call, this is unbelievable. I said to Eric, you're a savant, because the touchdown, even if they had tackled them at the 14-yard line or something, they would have taken a knee. It still would have ended 63-7. But no, it ended 70-7, and it was maybe the most lopsided loss in school history, as it turned out. And so it was a real learning moment. But I think with those moments, the fans are obviously upset. They're frustrated. I think it's okay to let them know that you're probably pretty frustrated too at those points without bashing the players. I try to be fair in that regard. I didn't play the game, and so I don't think it's right for me to sit there and criticize their effort unless it's really obvious. If you can tell that somebody's dogging it, then I think you have a responsibility to say that. Fortunately for me, I haven't seen many examples of that with the Iowa State teams through the years. So, but I think you're fair, you're honest, you don't try to sugarcoat it. They would see right through that. But at the same time, you empathize with those guys out on the field because you know how hard they work, and you know how tough it is for them. And no matter how frustrated you might be as a fan, it's 100 times more frustrating for them and for the coaches. So I try to be empathetic about that as well.
How much do you go back and analyze things you've said, games you've called? What's your re-listening like?
I don't do a lot of that anymore. I probably did more when I first started. I actually don't go back and listen to any of my broadcasts anymore. I will watch the highlights if they have our radio call on it on like our coach's show or whatever, and I'll see the big plays, but I don't go back and listen to a whole game anymore. I used to do that. I've found that your time is so precious, especially with the family and with the next game right around the corner, and I do football and basketball, and so the overlap of seasons, and you really don't have a lot of time to sit and go back and listen to games, and so I will go back and watch them. I'll watch the TV broadcast, listen to what they had to say, but also try to pick up on some things because no matter how well you feel like you called a game, there's always things you miss. There's always things you didn't see the first time when you were watching it live. And so I always go back with my notes that I take during the game, and I go back and I watch the game, and I might jot down a thing about a guy that had a key block or, a guy that missed a tackle or whatever the case may be, just to have that knowledge going forward. But just I enjoy rewatching the games and seeing the little intricacies that I missed. And then I'm really big on film, if I use an antiquated term, but going back and also recording the next team you're going to play and watching 2 or 3 of their games, because I feel that's the best way to get prepared for your next game. In addition to the game notes and the charts and the things that you do, I'm really big on tape and just watching and DVRing as many games as I can and having the opportunity to see that team play a couple times so that I really feel comfortable with their personnel before Iowa State goes and plays them.
Is that a personnel thing first and foremost, or is it like, will you look for trends of how they play or what they did? Or I mean, I'm sure it gives you an ability to reference back to things that happened in previous games, but in your prep, what's most important to you about being able to take in previous games? And I guess I'll lump into that if you go to Iowa State practices at all too.
Yeah, I try to go to practices some. I don't make as many during the season as I make during the preseason, but I think it's very valuable. And then in spring practice, I'm out there a lot. I think it's very valuable to be able to get to some practices and see the team. But I think the biggest thing is you ultimately end up knowing your team very, very well. And so my preparation, although it certainly includes getting, some trends that are going on with Iowa State and rewatching their games and things of that nature, when I'm watching the opponent, that's where I'm really studying and not trying to put myself on a pedestal or anything, because I really am looking at personnel. I'm not smart enough to know whether these formations are going to be a trend that I go to our defensive coordinator and say, hey, you better watch for this. I don't do that at all. But I think our color guy, Eric Heff, probably, having played college basketball, when he watches a basketball game, he can probably pick up on a few things that he can certainly add strategy wise. I watch that stuff and I pay attention to it, but I don't necessarily put that at the top of my list of why I do it. I certainly do it to try to make myself as familiar as possible with the personnel. And particularly, if you're getting ready to play an NCAA tournament opponent, and you find out on Sunday who you're playing on Thursday, and it might be Iona, and you haven't watched one of their games this year. And man, thank goodness for the invention of ESPN3 or ESPN Plus, because I'm going back that night and I also DVR a ton of games. I DVR all those conference tournament finals and anything, because you just never know who you're going to get, But it really, really helps before I do a broadcast to be able to watch that team, and also listening to some of the great announcers on TV calling those games. You pick up little nuggets that you can share with your audience during your broadcast as well, so it serves that purpose too.
I want to ask you about a non-play-by-play thing that you do professionally as well. I didn't know that Iowa State had its own 24/7 network of, I guess formerly, is it still linear or is it just digital now?
Well, it's a digital channel, which we also carry on local cable. So in the state of Iowa, and it dips into 4 surrounding states just a little bit, it's called Cyclones.TV, and it is a 24-hour, 7 days a week, dedicated to Iowa State athletics channel. And so they basically have just picked up what we did digitally, but also we now program it, and I'm in charge of putting in what the programming is going to be. So if you have 4 or 5 favorite Iowa State games, you just let me know, because I can make it your day on Cyclones.TV. I can cater the menu to you. But it's a fun thing. It's a neat thing. It's very unique. BYU has its own television network, but it's not all just sports. Obviously, there's the Longhorn Network, which is just Texas sports. But because of the Big 12's unique arrangement with Tier 3, Cyclones.TV exists in its form today, so we're really one of 3 nationally that have that kind of an entity. But of course, everything's changing with the ESPN Plus contract that's been agreed to with the Big 12 and ESPN. We'll jump on board with that. 4 of the Big 12 schools will jump on this year. We'll jump onto that next year, and we hope to continue Cyclones.TV in some way, shape, or form. We think it will. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like. We will not have live events on there anymore as far as games, because those properties will be owned by ESPN. But we will have, hopefully, replays of games, live press conferences, coaches' shows, and a lot of the documentary-type shows that we do that we really enjoy putting together. So it's been a great boon for Iowa State athletics, I think. It's gotten us into corners of the state. And you have to understand the state of Iowa. For years in the 70s and the 80s, early 80s in particular, Iowa really dominated the landscape in terms of media, because they were in every corner of the state on WHO radio, which had a very powerful signal, and then, had far more games televised than Iowa State. That has obviously shifted, and it is much more of a level playing field now. But still, there was a lot of ground to cover there, and especially in the corners of the state. We're right here in central Iowa, but when you got into Dubuque or Sioux City or some of those areas where there wasn't as much coverage of Iowa State, the ability to put our Cyclones.tv network in some of those markets has really enhanced our exposure in those markets, and it's been a great thing for Iowa State.
What else does it give you to worry about in terms of content creation and is particularly in this day and age how you balance the documentary type stuff you guys do with new media and short form and what plays well on Twitter and Instagram versus what you might do for television?
That's a great question, and it changes constantly. I think in recent years, our focus has gotten more to social media and recruiting, trying to help our programs attract great players and trying to tailor some of our short form videos to something that a 17, 18-year-old kid might really be impressed by and think, wow, that looks like a cool place. I think I'd like to go visit there. Because what we found at Iowa State through the years is that when guys come on campus to visit, they oftentimes commit, but it's hard sometimes just to get them to come here. They picture one thing and then they come here and it's something completely different. They just picture one big cornfield, for the state of Iowa, and they get here and they find out, no, it's a great campus, a great college town, and Des Moines, a vibrant city not far from here. And so they tend to find that it's a lot more than they had anticipated, and great fan base. And so we try to sell those things, not maybe sell's the wrong word, but give our coaches those tools to kind of enhance their product. But at the same time, you're putting on a 24/7 channel and you're trying to put on the best programming that you can on there. And no question, you're repeating a lot of classic games, and you're repeating a lot of, if you want to see Troy Davis, Cyclone legend, and you're a fan of Cyclones.tv, you've seen it, trust me, because, it's been on, I think 120 times we've aired it, and it's going to be 120 more probably in the next 2 years. But, so it's not that all the programming is fresh, but we juggle a lot of different things. I MC events, I do our coaches shows, I do the play-by-play for radio, and then do the Cyclones.tv, a lot of the reporting and the features and things like that. So I keep pretty busy, but a lot of it overlaps, and a lot of it really helps the play-by-play just because you get to know these student athletes a little bit better when you get to interview them and do features on them. And so I think it all kind of works together to give me my best chance to be successful.
Non-sports related question, just because I've never asked this question of anybody from your state, and I'm curious. What is a caucus like, and how many commercials are currently on television?
Great question again. Television stations love the caucuses because, they don't have to sell a darn thing, man. If I ever get out of this business, I want to be a sales guy at a TV station only during caucus season because it just is, so I like to say sometimes in our broadcast, it's stuck on automatic. You just plug and play, and but it is a big deal for our state, to get that first opportunity to really evaluate these candidates. And they come in, they're here on the 4th of July. I think there were something like 10 Democratic candidates in the state of Iowa on that day. So it's a big deal. And there's a reason why New Hampshire's fighting to try to get down there first, and other states would like to get push up ahead of Iowa. And, but at the same time, man, you get tired of watching all those political ads one after another. And if politics isn't your thing, you're going to get really sick of it. But, man, it's a boon for those TV stations, I'll tell you that.
John, if people want to find you, if they want to find Cyclones.tv, if they want to find the Cyclones on radio, how do they go about tracking you down?
Well, we're a Learfield IMG College affiliate, and so our games are Cyclones.tv. We play our audio of our games on there as well. Also, you can catch them on TuneIn, the TuneIn app, if you want to just listen to a game. Cyclones.tv is the website for to be able to pay a subscription fee and to be able to access lot of what we do is basically free. We do have some that's behind the paywall, but a lot of the features that we do and things like that, we just put out free, and we put it out through the accounts of the Cyclone football account or Cyclone men's basketball accounts. Those are good ones to follow. I'll retweet a lot of it. My Twitter handle is jwcyclones.tv. I'm not on Facebook. I can only handle one social media thing at a time, and so I'm just on Twitter. But we have a lot of fun with it. We have great coaches to work with, and it's just a blast, man. I feel so blessed to have gotten into this business and to work at this university. I just feel like it's been a fairy tale for me, and I'm really fortunate. And it all started with that lucky walk into the news director's office and showing him that I wasn't worth hiring.
John, I appreciate you taking the time and diving into some of it with us, and thanks for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure, Joel. Thanks for having me.
All right, hey, that is John Walters from Iowa State. If you find him on Twitter as well, he has links to the Cycast. If you want more Iowa State coverage or more John Walters in your life, you can check out the Iowa State Cyclones podcast as well. So a lot of different ways that you can catch what is going on in Ames, Iowa. I love politics. Man, I don't know if I could do the commercials in Iowa. Like, I can't do the commercials in Indiana. It's wild. It'd be cool to be in the thick of it, though. Every 4 years, you get the entire national media and everybody who ever wanted to be president ever in a non-reelect year from both parties. Oh, man. Talk about being in the epicenter of the news. It's kind of cool. Kind of cool. We're on a 7-day break. Back at it next week. This is Play-by-Playcast. My name is Joel Gadet, and we are out.
And that will do it from St. Louis, where the score is inconclusive.